This is not just the story of a boy with a sling. It is the story of fear that becomes a habit, and of faith that refuses to bow. It is the story of a nation standing in lines, armed on the outside, shaking on the inside. And it is the story of a God who turns battlefields into altars and ordinary people into witnesses. Because long before the stone flew, a war was already happening in the heart. And long before David faced a giant, Israel faced the question they were avoiding: who truly fights for the people of God? Let us go back in time, back before the songs, back before the shout of victory, back to the valley where courage went missing. The Philistines gathered their forces for war and camped in Judah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah. Two armies faced each other from two hills, with a valley between them like an open mouth waiting to swallow the first mistake. Morning after morning, the air over the valley felt heavy, not only because of dust and heat, but because everyone could feel that something worse than swords was approaching. From the Philistine camp, a champion stepped forward. His name was Goliath, from Gath. He did not walk into the valley like a soldier. He walked into it like a verdict. Metal flashed on him, bronze on his head, bronze on his body, bronze on his legs, and a spear that looked less like a weapon and more like a monument. He stopped where both armies could see him clearly. And then he spoke. He did not challenge Israel's strength. He challenged Israel's identity. He shouted for a man to come down and fight him. He offered terms that sounded simple but were built to humiliate. If Israel's champion killed him, Philistia would serve Israel. But if he killed Israel's man, Israel would serve the Philistines. Then he pushed the knife deeper. He defied the armies of Israel and demanded a fighter, as if the people of God had nothing to answer with. And when Saul and all Israel heard those words, Scripture says, they were dismayed and terrified. That fear did not stay in Saul's tent. It spread like smoke. It crawled into conversations. It turned strong men into watchers instead of warriors. It turned every sunrise into a countdown toward shame. Days became a pattern. Goliath came forward in the morning, and he came forward again in the evening. For 40 days, the same voice kept carving the same message into Israel's mind. You are small. You are trapped. You are about to lose. And every day, Israel answered him the same way. They said nothing. They waited behind shields that could not protect their courage. They listened to insults until insults began to sound like truth. Somewhere in that camp, men began to talk about rewards instead of faith. They spoke of wealth for whoever killed the giant. They spoke of the king's daughter in marriage. They spoke of freedom from taxes. Because when fear rules, people try to buy what only God can give. They were looking for a solution big enough to match the problem. But the longer they waited, the more impossible it felt. And while the valley kept echoing with the same defiance, life continued in the hills of Bethlehem, far from the armor, far from the shouting, far from the lines that refused to move. There, a shepherd boy named David was living the kind of day no one writes songs about. He was the youngest son of Jesse. His older brothers were with Saul at the war, but David went back and forth, tending his father's sheep. In other words, Israel's future was not standing in a battlefield. It was standing in a field. And on a certain day, Jesse called David and gave him an ordinary mission. Take roasted grain and bread to your brothers. Take cheeses to their commander. See how your brothers are. Bring back a sign that they are alive. It sounded simple. It sounded small. But in the hands of God, small errands become doorways into destiny. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of another shepherd. He loaded the supplies, and he set out, not knowing he was walking toward the sentence that had paralyzed a nation. He arrived as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. The cry sounded brave, but the valley knew the truth. Israel could shout. Israel could line up. Israel could look like an army, but Israel could not step forward. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines to greet his brothers. And while he was talking with them, the giant stepped out again. It was the same routine, the same distance, the same contempt, the same defiance. But this time, something changed. David heard it. He watched the men of Israel flee in great fear when they saw Goliath. He saw the way grown warriors scattered like frightened children, and inside the shepherd boy, a different kind of question began to rise. Not, how big is he? But, who does he think he is? To speak like that to the armies of the living God. David did not run from the sound that made soldiers run. He ran toward it. He looked at the men around him and began asking questions. Not questions of fear, but questions of meaning. He asked what would be done for the man who struck the Philistine down and removed the disgrace from Israel. The men answered him with the same rehearsed words. Like a promise they repeated to keep themselves from despair. But David was not satisfied with prizes, because his heart was not centered on reward. His heart was centered on the insult. He kept saying the words that nobody wanted to say out loud. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And that sentence was dangerous. Because when fear controls a camp, courage sounds like rebellion. When David's oldest brother Eliab heard him speaking with the men, anger rose in him like heat off the valley stones. Eliab did not argue with the giant. He argued with his little brother. He snapped, asking why David had come down there. He mocked the smallness of David's life and asked who was watching those few sheep in the wilderness. He accused David of pride and of coming only to watch the battle. In other words, Eliab tried to shrink David back into the box everyone had assigned him. Stay small. Stay unseen. Stay silent. Because if David stayed silent, everyone else could keep pretending that silence was wisdom. David answered with the restraint of someone who has learned to stay steady under misunderstanding. He said, "Now, what have I done?" He said, "Can't I even speak?" And then he turned away, not because he was offended, but because he was on a mission deeper than his brother's opinion. He asked others the same questions again, and the people gave him the same answer again. But something had changed now. David's words began to travel. Courage is contagious in a camp that has forgotten what it feels like. What David said was overheard. It was reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David walked into the king's presence, but he did not walk in like a fan meeting a legend. He walked in like a servant carrying a burden for the whole nation. He said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine." He said, "Your servant will go and fight him." The king looked at him and saw only what fear always sees. Saul saw youth. Saul saw inexperience. Saul saw a boy where a warrior was required. Saul answered that David was not able to go against the Philistine and fight him. He reminded David that Goliath had been a warrior from his youth. Saul was measuring the moment by visible weight, but David began to measure it by memory. He did not start by boasting about courage. He started by telling the truth about the unseen battles that shaped him. He told Saul he had been keeping his father's sheep. He told Saul that when a lion or a bear carried off a sheep from the flock, he went after it. He struck it. He rescued the lamb from its mouth. And when the predator turned on him, he seized it by its hair and struck it down. David was not romanticizing the field. He was revealing the training ground God had chosen. Then, David said the line that exposes why he could stand where others froze. He said the Lord who rescued him from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear would rescue him from the hand of this Philistine. That was David's logic. Past rescue becomes present confidence. Not confidence in self, confidence in the God who delivers. Saul finally spoke words that sounded like permission, but also sounded like surrender. He told David to go, and he said, "May the Lord be with you." And with that blessing, a shepherd was released into a battlefield. But the next step would test whether David was going to fight like Saul, or whether David was going to fight like David. Saul tried to prepare David the only way Saul knew how. He dressed the shepherd in a king's idea of protection. He placed a bronze helmet on David's head. He put a coat of armor on him. He gave David the weight of a battlefield identity David had never lived in. David fastened the sword over the armor and tried to walk, but his body told the truth before his mouth did. He could not move well. The steps were awkward. The metal was foreign. The armor did not turn him into a warrior. It turned him into a prisoner inside someone else's confidence. And David said to Saul the sentence that separates calling from costume. "I can't walk in these. I am not used to them." So David took them off. In that moment, the camp saw something they did not expect. The man who was about to face the giant refused to borrow the king's image. He refused to pretend strength. He refused to hide fear behind bronze. He chose to go down into the valley as who he truly was. Not because he believed in his own size, but because he believed in the God who had met him in smaller places. David took his staff in his hand. He walked away from the tent of the king and toward the open mouth of the valley. On the way, he came to a stream cutting through the land like a quiet line of mercy. He bent down. He chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. He placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. He held his sling in his hand. And then Scripture says he approached the Philistine. The valley was wide. The air was tense. Every step forward felt like stepping away from safety and into a story no one could reverse. Across the space, the Philistine also began to move. Goliath advanced with his shield-bearer in front of him. The giant looked David over, and he despised him because David was young and ruddy and looked like someone who belonged anywhere except a battlefield. Goliath's contempt sharpened into mockery. He said, "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" Then he cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said the words that had ruled the valley for 40 days. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." This was not only intimidation, it was ritual humiliation. It was a giant trying to make the outcome feel decided before the first move. But David did not step back. David did not look down. He did not answer with an equal insult. He answered with a confession. He answered with a name. He answered with the only thing that can stand when size becomes a sermon of fear. David looked up at the towering man of bronze and breathed in the moment everyone else feared. Then he spoke, not to impress Israel, but to confront the lie that size equals authority. He said, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David was not denying the weapons in the giant's hands. He was denying the giant's claim to be the final word. Then David declared what the valley had not heard in 40 days. He declared that the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hand. He declared that this would not be a private victory, but a public witness. He declared that all the earth would know there is a God in Israel. He declared that all who were watching would learn something Israel had forgotten. He said, "The Lord does not save by sword or spear." He said, "The battle is the Lord's." And with that, David did something that made no sense to fear. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. He did not back away slowly. He did not wait for a safer angle. He ran. Because faith does not always look calm. Sometimes faith looks like forward motion when everyone expects retreat. David reached into his bag. His fingers found a smooth stone. He placed it into the sling with the familiarity of a shepherd who had practiced in lonely places. He began to swing the sling. The cords tightened. The circle widened. The sound of leather cutting air was small compared to armor clashing. But the valley held its breath anyway. Then David released. The stone flew. It struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and the giant fell face down on the ground. In one moment, the voice that had ruled the valley was silenced. In one moment, fear lost its spokesman. Scripture says David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. It says he struck down the Philistine and killed him. And it says there was no sword in David's hand. But the story was not finished. David ran and stood over the fallen champion. He took the Philistine's sword and drew it from its sheath. He used it to finish the giant, and he cut off his head. Then the shock turned into motion. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. The spell over Israel broke. The men who had been hiding found their breath again. Israel surged forward, shouting, pursuing, pressing the enemy back. The valley that had held 40 days of shame now carried the sound of deliverance. And somewhere behind the lines, Saul watched a shepherd standing where no one else would stand. But the greatest battle in this chapter was not only the battle in the valley. It was the battle over what Israel believed about God. The moment the giant fell, the valley changed its language. For 40 days it had spoken shame. Now it spoke movement. The men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout. They pursued the Philistines. The enemy that had sounded unstoppable only hours earlier now sounded like retreat. And Israel, who had been frozen, suddenly remembered how to chase. After the pursuit, they returned and plundered the Philistine camp. The battlefield gave up what it had been holding. Spoils replaced silence. But David did something that showed this victory was not going to be treated like a private moment. He took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. And he put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. In other words, the proof of the giant was not going to disappear into rumor. It would become a witness that could not be denied. Back in the camp, Saul watched David as he went out to meet the Philistine. Saul had seen the boy step into the valley. Saul had seen the boy come back out. And something in Saul's mind began to shift from relief to calculation. Because victory always creates a second battle. The battle over meaning. The battle over ownership. The battle over who will be remembered. Saul turned to Abner, the commander of the army. He asked a question that sounds simple but is loaded with power. Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner answered with an honesty that shows how unexpected David's rise truly was. As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. The king commanded him to find out, because Saul was not only asking for a name, he was asking for an origin. He was asking what house this courage belonged to. He was asking how close this new strength might come to the throne. When David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. David still held the Philistine's head in his hand. The weight of it was more than physical. It was the weight of a new chapter opening in Israel. Saul looked at David and asked directly, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered with a humility that does not match the glory of the moment. "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." He did not say, "I am the giant slayer." He did not say, "I am the hero." He said, "I belong to a household." He said, "I come from Bethlehem." The valley had lifted him into the spotlight, but David's words still carried the dust of the field. Yet even if David stayed humble, the nation would not stay quiet. Because after a public victory, people always start singing. And those songs have consequences kings cannot control. Israel had won a battle in a valley. But the story did not end in the valley. Because after God silences one giant, the human heart often builds another. When the army returned, women came out from the towns of Israel. They sang and danced to meet the returning warriors, and their song carried a blade hidden inside celebration. They sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul heard it, and the same king who had just been saved by a shepherd began to feel threatened by him. Saul was very angry. He counted the words like losses. He said they had credited David with tens of thousands, but him with only thousands. He feared what the song was implying. He thought the only thing left for David was the kingdom itself. And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. That is how quickly glory can become a trap. That is how quickly a miracle can be followed by insecurity. In one chapter, the giant falls. In the next, envy begins to rise. And this is where the story becomes a mirror. Because many people think David and Goliath is mainly about bravery. But Scripture keeps pushing deeper. David said it clearly before the stone ever flew. "It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's." In other words, the center of the story is not the size of David. It is the name David carried into the valley. The living God whom the giant defied. The same pattern still happens. A voice of intimidation can stand in front of a person for a long time. It can repeat the same message until the message starts sounding like truth. You are too small. You are too late. You are too weak. But David's faith exposes what fear tries to hide. The real giant is not always outside of us. Sometimes the real giant is the shame that keeps us silent. Sometimes the real giant is the fear that keeps us behind the lines. Sometimes the real giant is the belief that God only works through what looks impressive. David walked into the valley without armor that did not fit. He walked in with what God had trained in his hands in the unseen places. And he spoke as if God was not theory, but reality. If today a giant has been speaking over your life, do not let the voice become your identity. Do not let 40 days of intimidation rewrite what God has already called you. The same Lord who does not save by sword or spear is still Lord over battles that feel bigger than you. And when God gives victory, guard your heart afterward, because some battles end in the valley, but others begin in the applause. If you know someone who feels trapped behind fear's battle line, share this story with them. And if you want more biblical stories told with depth and light behind the shadows, subscribe to this channel and stay close.
Thank you.